Hey there, tweens and teens. This is Stacey, your Teen Services Library Assistant at the Goffstown Public Library, and you are tuning in to Book Browsing with Stacey. So in Book Browsing with Stacey, I put together a collection of books and tell you a little bit about them. I maybe read from the book flap, find an excerpt, and then at the end of the segment, I tell you one of my latest reads in a small book review, or one of the latest reads of someone on our staff and their book review. So for this book browsing segment, I actually have a theme involved. See, we are not far away from the next presidential election, so I thought what a wonderful time to put together a collection of fiction and nonfiction books that talk about voting. Okay, so I also want to make sure that you know that I put some resources in the description field. So if you need to find out information about voter registration, I put some information in there. If you want to find out about pre-registering, because even though you have to be 18 to vote, did you know that in some states you can pre-register at a younger age? So I put some information in there. If you need to find out where to actually vote, that's called your polling place, I've also linked some information for that as well. Okay, now I think it's probably, oh wait, that's right. This is about voting, and I know that some of you who might not be voting age yet are saying, oh, I'm gonna abandon this video. What does it have to do with me? No, stick around. Just because you can't vote does not mean that you don't play an active role in our American government system. And just because we're focusing this theme on the upcoming presidential election, it doesn't mean that you should only think about voting every 4 years, or that you should only think about being involved every 4 years. Because in order to enact change, oftentimes you need to start at home. That means starting local. So in your communities, in your city and town, in your state. That's right, it's important to also be involved in your local government. Okay, this is a lot to unpack. I'm sure your head is spinning. That's why we have some books to help, so let's get right into them. Let's go book browsing. Okay, so book number 1 is called Votes of Confidence, A Young Person's Guide to American Elections. And it is by Jeff Fleischer. It is a nonfiction book, and I actually think it's absolutely fabulous. Let me read a little bit from the back. It's an in-depth introduction to the American election cycle. Every 4 years, coverage of the presidential election turns more into a horse race story about who's leading the polls and who said what when. Social media is great at providing breaking news, but less great at providing context. Younger readers, who might only be old enough to remember 1 or 2 other elections, they aren't provided with much information about how the election process actually works, why it matters, or how they can become involved. With civics education becoming less common in schools, it's important for young and future voters to know what's going on. Using a fun, casual voice and interesting sidebars, and anecdotes that tell stories rather than just list facts, author Jeff Fleischer provides an essential resource that will remain relevant even after the next president is chosen. So this book right here is actually kind of a small book, but it has jam-packed with information, running at just about 219 pages. And back that has some more resources and information. So I chose to take an excerpt from chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about how voting works, but we're actually not going to talk about that part. The part that I thought was most important is section 1 in that chapter, and it's why vote. Because you might be asking me that question right now. Stacey, why vote? Why are you even doing this video? So I think that there were 3 great reasons in this book, right in this chapter, talking about voting. So let me tell you reason number 1. It's your civic responsibility. See, campaigns are basically a job interview, and election day is the hiring decision. Other than age and citizenship, there are no specific requirements for becoming the president or a senator or congressman other than what voters are willing to support. All the campaigning, all the advertising, all the policy statements, at the end of the day, it's all about winning. And quite frankly, who do you want to win? You want to win that candidate that most likely aligns with the policies, the platforms, the things that you're interested in, the things that you want to see improved in your communities and in your nation. So it's important for you to be involved in that, to have a voice in putting that person forward to win. So reason number 2, making government better. Well, that kind of goes with reason number 1, because hopefully you're doing your research on that candidate that you think will make the country better or your local communities better. So it doesn't mean that it's easy or that it happens in one election cycle. But voting can influence who runs for office and how they behave once they do. If candidates who actually propose real solutions to climate change or the national debt or income inequality consistently do well, then more candidates are going to feel comfortable campaigning on those kinds of important issues. Those who already have a plan will be more willing to talk about it, and those who would rather avoid the issue will feel pressure to take a stand. And reason number 3 is to make your voice heard. If that doesn't make you feel inspired or guilty enough to get involved, look at it this way. The very fact that you're able to vote is a sign of progress. Remember, when the United States was new, most states, and it's the states, not the federal government, that have always had control over voting, only let white men who owned land vote. Expanding voting rights was always a struggle, since the officials in charge had, by definition, benefited from the way things were. After all, the way things were put them in office. But popular movements obviously played a big role, and it sometimes took activists decades of work, but eventually enough members of Congress and enough state legislatures were convinced to pass and ratify the constitutional amendments covered in the last chapter. So that was in chapter 1. So in the first chapter, you're going to get a little bit of history about the right to vote. All right, so keep in mind that while the federal government outlaws that kind of discrimination now, citizens don't technically have a federal right to vote, and some states handle that right differently. And we'll talk about that later in the book when we cover how to vote. But first, let's take a look at how elections work, starting with the big prize, the presidential election. So if you want to know more about voting, how it works, this is the book for you. The next book that I picked out is a graphic novel. It's called Drawing the Vote by Tommy Jenkins. It's an illustrated guide to voting in America. Every time an American citizen votes, they are taking part in the long struggle for voting rights. If that story began as the framers of the Constitution debated how to share power in the United States, it even continues today in battles over voter identification, gerrymandering, foreign interference, and the closing of polling places. Americans still do not agree on how to ensure the right to vote, and Drawing the Vote explains how we got here. So in the last book, we talked a little bit about voter rights, and yes, progress has been made, but it doesn't mean that progress still doesn't need to be made. And quite frankly, if that is something that's a platform you want to stand on and that's important to you, then by all means, get out there and vote for that. And the other thing is, if you're not able to vote because you're not 18 yet, you can still be a part of it. And that part is learning current events, learning what's going on around you, talking to people, get the information. You'll be well prepared later on when it is time to vote. Okay, so Drawing the Vote looks at the history of voting rights in the United States and how it has shaped the way we vote today. Author Tommy Jenkins tracks the major political events from the American Revolution to the present day, including the Civil War, the fight for women's suffrage, the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, gerrymandering, voter suppression, and control of our government by a Republican majority. Along the way, Jenkins identifies events and trends that led to the 2016 presidential election, which left Americans wondering, how did this happen? At a time when many citizens are experiencing apathy about voting, unease about election security, and skepticism concerning our bitterly divided political parties, Jenkins offers comprehensive, accessible explanations for how we got here and how every American can take action to make their voice heard and their vote count. With detailed illustrations by 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝗀, Drawing the Vote is an essential reading for anyone interested in the future of our democratic process. And so I thought it was interesting to take a look in the back of this book. I'll show you a little bit. Like I told you, it is a graphic novel. That might be appealing to some people. Sometimes I think that the pictures there, along with the words, makes it a little bit easier to understand certain things that are going on, I think, especially when we're talking about government and politics. All right, the word gerrymandering first appeared in 1812 in the Boston Gazette newspaper. Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed a bill creating a district to ensure certain party representation. The editorial cartoonist from the Gazette turned it into a clawed animal, and thus the term was born. Let's think of gerrymandering as a game of Twister. In Twister, People often have to contort themselves into seemingly impossible positions to win. In gerrymandering, legislatures draw maps of ridiculous shapes to help their parties stay in power. Don't worry, I'm crafting the perfect district. We like to think of it creating legislative districts as doing a jigsaw puzzle, but that's not how it works. All right, honestly, I think that this is the funniest cartoon of crafting the perfect district right there. Arts and crafts time. All right, we're in charge. We'll draw the maps. We hear a lot about gerrymandering today. It is easy to think that this is a recent phenomenon. However, in 1788, even before the Constitution was ratified, Patrick Henry and his followers redrew Virginia's 5th Congressional District, so Henry's political opponent, James Madison, would face James Monroe, a tougher candidate. Madison won anyway. The book goes on to talk about, in 1842, how Congress passed an apportionment act that said that congressional districts must be contiguous and that one person was elected from each district. So the book goes on to explain a little bit more about gerrymandering and why it's actually not good for our political process. So if you are interested in this book, Drawing the Vote, and you want to see our political process in graphic novel form, this might be the book for you. Okay, so our last nonfiction book that I'd like to present to you is One Person, No Vote, How Not All Voters Are Treated Equally. And it has tips on how teens can make a difference. So I thought that this by Carol Anderson was a really important book. The milestone election of President Barack Obama should have been a signal of racial progress. But in the aftermath of this victory, a movement has emerged that threatens a cornerstone of democracy, the promise that each vote counts. When a 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decision undid the protections offered by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the floodgates opened to voter suppression on a whole new scale. From photo ID requirements to gerrymandering and poll closures, this book explores the ways that racist political maneuverings work to limit voting rights and the ways that activists are fighting to restore them. It's complete with a discussion guide, photographs, and information about becoming involved as a teen during elections. This is an essential explanation of the history of voting rights and a call to action for a better future. So the thing I love about this book is the back has an extensive, I mean really extensive note section and where the information came from for the book. It really is superb, and if anyone's a little bit of a researcher, this is the book for you. You would love to follow all those little rabbit trails. The other thing that I thought was great, and this is the part that I'm going to read right now, the excerpt, was how to get involved in your community. There are lots of ways to get involved with voting in your community, and here are a few. So first, you should register. If you are 18 and a documented citizen, you can register to vote. In many states, you need to register ahead of time. Not in New Hampshire, you can register on the actual day at your polling place. Every state has different rules, so check with your local election office, and that's why I put those resources in the description field. Don't forget to allow plenty of time before the election that you'd like to participate in. Many states require registration at least several weeks in advance. So this is timely. You've got to get out there now. All right. Help others vote. And this is where, if you are not 18, this might be a place where you can help in the voting process. Help others. If you're too young or you can't register yourself, you can still help others. Use those same local election websites to help family, friends, and neighbors register. Confirm registrations are up to date for people. Check information on absentee and early voting rules, which is a huge thing right now. And rules have been expanded so that every vote can be heard in this election during COVID times. So make sure you find out about these absentee early voting rules and locate polling places. Make sure people have a voting plan. That is, ask people, hey, are you willing to go and vote? Are you going to go vote? The other thing I think that might be really important for the first-time voter, the first teen voter, is to research your ballot. You might be voting for more candidates and topics than you actually realize. So most states will provide sample ballots on their websites. Many individual groups, including nonprofits, will put together resources and lists that recommend who to vote for, or at least tell the policies and the platforms that they're standing on so that you can do a little bit of research. These can be valuable resources, but always check for the fine print that tells you the name of the group that makes that suggestion. That way you can decide if their interests actually align with yours. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but isn't it worth it to make sure that you have the right person in place to lead your country forward? The best research is always your own, so read, watch, listen, and discuss as best you can. All right, so those are our nonfiction choices for voting information. We actually have some fiction books that talk about voting as well in a teen scene. Let's get to those next. Okay, so our first fiction book is Yes, No, Maybe So by Becky Albertalli and Aisha Saeed. This book is a love story with a heavy dose of comedy between a strong female lead and a clumsy, awkward boy. I bet you're wondering how our typical boy meets girl storyline fits in with a theme of voting. Well, enter the backstory of the importance of local activism as these two not yet old enough to vote teens find themselves roped into canvassing for a progressive candidate in an effort to flip their historically conservative voting district. So let's read the inside flap. Jamie Goldberg is cool with volunteering for his local state Senate candidate, as long as he's behind the scenes. When it comes to speaking to strangers, or let's face it, to speaking to almost anyone, Jamie's a choke artist. There's no way he'd ever knock on doors to ask people for their votes until he meets Maya. Maya Raymond's having the worst Ramadan ever. Her best friend is too busy to hang out, her summer trip is canceled, and her parents are separating. Why her mother thinks the solution to her problems is political canvassing with some awkward dude she hardly knows is beyond her. Going door to door isn't exactly glamorous, but maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. After all, the polls are getting closer, and so are Maya and Jamie. Mastering local activism is one thing. Navigating the cross-cultural crush of the country is another thing entirely. New York Times bestselling authors Becky Albertalli and Aisha Saeed have crafted a resonant, funny, and memorable story about the power of love and resistance. This book is an engaging read with likable characters. It's culturally and religiously diverse and told in multiple perspectives. This might be your next read. Our next fiction book, The State of Us by Sean David Hutchinson. As if being a teenager is not complicated enough, add in one of your parents vying to become President of the United States of America. Meet Dean Arnold. He is a straight-laced, buttoned-up kind of guy, and his mother is the Republican presidential candidate. Her platform wants trans soldiers banned from the military. Did I mention that Dean is on the asexual spectrum? He can't really see himself attracted to anyone, and nobody knows that. He hasn't shared that with anyone. Next, meet Mexican-American 𝗕𝗫 Rosario. He is openly gay, and his dad is a Democratic presidential candidate who rose to popularity defending asylum seekers. Dean and 𝗕𝗫 couldn't be more different, but after being trapped together at a campaign function, they start to realize they're the only two that can completely understand the pressure that they're under. A friendship buds, and maybe more. Let's read. When Dean Arnold's mother decided to run for president, it wasn't a surprise to anyone, least of all her son. But that doesn't mean that Dean was ready for the nonstop scrutiny that comes along with it. To the public, Dean is a button-down, shirt-wearing Republican, straight-A high school student. No one knows who Dean really is until Dean meets 𝗕𝗫 Rosario. The problem is, 𝗕𝗫's the son of the Democratic opposition. It all starts when Dean and 𝗕𝗫 find themselves locked together in the green room before their parents' first debate. The boys are surprised as their instant connection. Soon, chance meetings on the campaign trail become less left to coincidence. And Dean and 𝗕𝗫's friendship quickly becomes a romantic connection, unlike any either of the boys have ever known. But if it wasn't hard enough being on opposite sides of the aisles, a shady third-party candidate suddenly claims to have pictures that will change everything. Pictures that could cause Dean and 𝗕𝗫's worlds to fall apart. It's a new modern-day star-crossed romance about what it really means to love your country, and most importantly, yourself. From acclaimed author Sean David Hutchinson. So this LGBTQIA diverse romance is a thought-provoking read with two very likable characters. It's sprinkled with its fair share of humor and also told in multiple perspectives. This might be another great read. Okay, this next book, Your Own Worst Enemy by Gordon Jack. Remember how I said earlier that sometimes in order to create change, it must happen closer to home? Well, this story is not set on the national campaign trail or even at the state campaign level, but instead in the almighty halls of high school. Follow these 3 candidates running for Lincoln High Student Body President. They all have 3 different platforms and they will stop at nothing to be elected. Let's read. They say that with great power comes great responsibility. Unless you're student body president at Lincoln High School, then you get all the responsibility, but none of the power. So let's meet the candidates. Stacey Wynn, the front runner. Everyone expects Stacey to win. She's won every student election since freshman year, but she didn't count on a beautiful French-Canadian transfer student running too. Not only is she challenging Stacey for the title, but she's putting the moves on Stacey's best and only friend, campaign advisor, Brian. Julia Romero, the rebel. Julia is only interested in becoming president to avoid being sent back to Canada. That, and she doesn't think the school does enough for its immigrant students. If she can prove that she's the next Malala Yousafzai, she may be able to stay in California with Brian. Tony Guo, the way outsider. Tony is usually oblivious to the school's political campaigning, as he's oblivious to anything that isn't getting high and drinking mass quantities of 𝗕𝗫𝗀 chocolate milk. But when his favorite beverage is banned, a freshman political mastermind convinces Tony to become the voice of the little guy. Tony goes along with it because, well, he doesn't have anything better to do. 3 candidates, 3 platforms, and a whirlwind of social media. Gaffes and protests make for a ridiculous political circus. With a satirical nod to current events, Gordon Jack's sophomore novel shines a spotlight on the highs and very lows of the electoral process, ultimately proving that the popular vote really is the one that matters most. This book is witty, amusing, and full of high drama, but the book also reveals the complexity of race, privilege, and class as it relates to the American political process. And at the end, Your Own Worst Enemy reminds us that hope just may lie in the younger generation. Okay, so finally, our last book is called The Voting Booth, and it is by Brandy Colbert. I read this book in one sitting. It is that good and that intriguing. And it's what we would call a 24-hour story because the story unfolds over the course of one full day. And what a day it is, because see, it is voting day. And both Marva and Duke are ready to do their civic duty. So Marva has longed for this day. She is passionate about getting the vote out and letting people's voice be heard at the voting booth. Now, Duke, on the other hand, he just wants to get this day over with because, quite frankly, he has something big in center, his first big paying gig later that night. That's all that's on his mind. Unfortunately, because of a registration mix-up, Duke is turned away from the place that he thought that he could go to vote. Marva overhears this. She steps in and she wants to make sure that Duke gets his right to cast his vote. Over the course of the day, these 2 strangers bond over the mission to vote and much stronger issues also, like voter suppression, educational inequities, violence, grief, and social justice. All right, let's go ahead and read inside. Marva Sheridan was born ready for this day. She's always been driven to make a difference in the world. And what better way than to vote in her first election? Duke Crenshaw is so done with this election. He just wants to get voting over with so he can prepare for his band's first paying gig tonight. Only problem? Duke can't vote. When Marva sees Duke turned away from their polling place, she takes it upon herself to make sure his vote is counted. She hasn't spent months doorbelling and registering voters just to see someone denied their right. And that's how their whirlwind day begins. Rushing from precinct to precinct, cutting school, waiting in endless lines, turned away time and time again, trying to do one simple thing, vote. They may have started out as strangers, but as Duke and Marva team up to beat a rigged system and find Marva's missing cat, it's clear that there's more to their connection than a shared mission for democracy. Romantic and triumphant, the voting booth is proof that you can't sit around waiting for the world to change. But some things are meant to be. Okay, we can see that romance and comedic antics are at the forefront of this lighthearted, feel-good read. But make no mistake, there is abundant food for thought about the ways that social, economic, and racial barriers shape lives and how the teens in this story engage to have a voice in a political system that makes it difficult for them to participate. All right, so I highly, 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 highly recommend The Voting Booth. I loved this book. It is told in multiple perspectives, as are the other ones in this book browsing series, but that's really important because I think it really allows you to get to the heart of each of the characters and see the different positions that they're coming from and really attempt to walk in their shoes. So I'm hoping one of these books today will be your next great read. So that's it for book browsing. Now, if you want to make sure that you don't miss any of our great content going forward, you have to subscribe to Goffstown Public Library's YouTube channel. Okay, until next time, happy reading. Bye.